Hello and welcome to Central Coast Council's Environmental Education channel. I'm Ashley and today I'm going to talk you through Composting 101. If you want to reduce your environmental footprint, then setting up a compost bin at home is really one of the best things that you can do. Did you know that on the Central Coast last year, a third of people's red bins were full of kitchen scraps, organic material that ended up in landfill unnecessarily? It also equates to about $3,800 per household per year in groceries that are wasted, and up to a third of the food that we produce ends up getting thrown out, which is really sad. The reason it's problematic for all of that waste to end up in landfill is because when it breaks down in landfill, it produces really toxic greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. It was responsible for up to 1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere last year, which really accelerates that process of climate change. The solution is really simple. If everyone diverts that food waste out of their red bins into a compost bin, not only will we be doing our bit for the environment, but we also get this beautiful byproduct of compost, which is an organic, slow-release fertiliser that we can put back onto our gardens to help grow our own food, like fruit and vegetables, and also to provide plants, native species that are habitat and food for our wildlife and our really important insect pollinators to help them thrive. You might be wondering whether a worm farm or a compost bin or even a Bokashi bin is the best system for you. If you have a garden where you can produce garden waste and a bare patch of earth where you can put a compost bin, then compost bins are definitely the best solution. But if you don't have a garden or a bare patch of earth to put the compost bin on, then you might be better off looking at a worm farm, and I will talk about them in a separate video. But I highly recommend that everyone watch the video on the Bokashi bin system, because the combination of composting and Bokashi is the ultimate system, and that's what I use at home. This is my Bokashi bin that I have sitting on my kitchen bench, and I actually put all of my food scraps into the Bokashi bin, and once it's full, I let it sit and ferment for 2 weeks, and I then add it into my compost, and it makes the compost break down 10 times faster, and it introduces all really beneficial microbes into your compost system to help it thrive. There are quite a few different compost systems available on the market. You might have seen some people with an enclosed bin that tumbles. Now, these work on a batch system, which means you can't continually add into them, and for that reason, I don't recommend them. Some people also have the space to create an open compost pile or heap system, but because these are open, they can attract pests such as rodents, and so for that reason, I don't recommend them either. What I do recommend is these enclosed bins. You can get them for a council subsidy from the Compost Revolution website. Once you've got your bin, you'll need to find a suitable place in your yard to set it up. It needs to be a sheltered area that has good sun and lots of drainage. It also needs to be convenient for you to access it so that you can easily go from your kitchen with your scraps outside and put them in without having to trek too far, which might be a barrier that might prevent you from using it. Once you get the bin, you will notice that one end has a lid on it, that is the top, and the other end is actually open. And this is the end that goes on the bare ground. If you are worried about rodents getting in under the bottom of your compost bin, I recommend you get some wire mesh, put it under the compost bin, wrap it up around the sides and tie it in place with a piece of rope. It does need to be exposed to the bare ground so things like worms can come and go, but that wire mesh will stop any rodents from being able to get in under it. Once you've got it in place on the bare ground with your wire layer, the last thing left to do is put a 30 centimetre drainage layer into the bottom. So you can use things like sticks, so you can get some sticks straight out of your garden, and you can also use things like wood chip. You want it to be a really dry, coarse layer that can drain the water through it, and you want a 30 centimetre layer at the bottom of your compost bin to set it up and start getting that drainage happening. In order to create a really healthy compost system, I think it's important to understand some of the scientific principles behind a really good compost system. Firstly, understand that it uses a process called aerobic decomposition, and that produces heat. And there are 4 really essential components that are needed in order to create that aerobic decomposition. And I remember them using the acronym ADAM, A-D-A-M. Now the first A stands for aliveness, and that refers to all of the organisms that live in your compost and help to break down the food, including things like worms that come up from under the ground, and fungi and bacteria, the good bacteria, especially if you're using a Bokashi system, that'll help introduce lots of microorganisms that help break down the food. Now the D in Adam stands for diversity, and that relates to the diversity of the things that you put into your compost system. There are two categories of things that you should be putting into your compost system. You can easily remember them as the green things and the brown things, but scientifically they're referred to as the carbon elements and the nitrogen elements. Now let's start with the carbon elements. These are your brown things. You can get produce from your garden, such as dry leaves. In autumn and winter, these are really easy to come by, and they will really help create diversity in your compost system. You can also use some dried up brown bark. You can use some cardboard or some torn up paper. If you want to put them into your compost instead of recycling, that's a great bonus. Just tear them into little strips or shred your paper before you put it in there, and that will help it to break down. And if you don't have any of those things, you can always get some straw, and that'll help add that carbon layer into your system. Now the green layer is the nitrogen layer, and these can either be green garden produce, things like green fresh clippings from your garden, or things like these beautiful fresh green lawn clippings. This also includes your kitchen scraps. So with kitchen scraps, you can put heaps of different fruits, vegetables and other produce in there. These are some coffee grounds that are really good. You can use tea bags as well, and all of your fruit and vegetable peels, they contribute to the green layer. And it's important to get a balance between the green and the brown. You probably want to put a little bit more brown than green into the system, but the best way to get the ratio right is just to observe it. You want the balance to be this damp, sort of sweet mixture. If you put too much of the green in, it's going to be too wet and it might get stinky. If you put too much of the dry in, it's going to be too dry and it's not going to break down properly. So get that balance right, and you should have a really healthy system. Now the second A in the Adam acronym stands for aeration, and that's where this aerator really comes in handy. This is a little tool that you can use to introduce air into your compost bin to help get the aeration that is needed for the aerobic composition to happen. And you can use this by simply turning the handle to screw it down halfway into your compost bin, then pulling it up and shaking it as you go, which will introduce lots of air into that system. Now the final acronym, the M in the acronym ADAM, stands for moisture. And that is really important because you want the compost to be about as wet as a damp cloth. And that should be achievable through the addition of the green layers, but if not, you can just get a little bit of water in a watering can, add that onto your compost, and remember to keep observing it to make sure you get that balance right. Not too dry, not too wet, just like a nice damp sponge. There are a few important things to avoid putting in your compost, and that includes large amounts of meat, dairy, eggs, citrus, onion, fats, oils, those type of things. Also, don't put any dog or cat poo or vacuum dust in your compost bin, and also avoid really strongly scented leaves like eucalyptus or pine needles or any big chunks of wood. Now, a little tip, if you cut up all of your kitchen scraps into really small pieces, that will help them break down faster. And if you keep your aerator next to your compost bin, it'll help remind you that you need to aerate it each time you add those kitchen scraps. I also like to spend my weekends collecting a little bucket of dry leaves and have that sitting next to my compost bin so that every time I put some kitchen scraps in, I have that ready to go to put on top of the system to keep that balance there. You can also buy some conditioners, which are like a powder that balances the pH in your bin. So I sprinkle this onto my compost bin about once a week. And the final thing that I do is put a blanket over my compost bin. You can buy these Hessian blankets that you put inside the bin. It keeps it nice and dark and moist. It stops the moisture from evaporating, and it keeps any worms inside your system really happy and healthy. You may be wondering how we can utilize the compost generated from these enclosed bins. Now, the food that we put into the top of the system won't have broken down, so we always harvest from the bottom of the bins. And that's also why it's really important that we only aerate the top half when we use our aerators, when we add food, so we don't mix that new food with the composted material that's built up at the bottom of the bin. Some of the bins will have a little trap door at the bottom that you can open, and you can use a little shovel to scrape out the readily composted material from underneath. But if yours doesn't have a trapdoor like mine here, it's really easy. You just have to either lift it up a little bit or tip it over to its side a little bit so that you can get under with your shovel, scrape out that ready compost that has accumulated on the bottom, and you will know that it's ready when it looks like crumbled up chocolate cake. Once it looks like that, you know that it's ready to put on your garden as a slow release fertiliser or a soil, and that will really help to improve the health of lots of plants in your garden. And it's a real win-win. Personally, I feel like it's a win because I don't have to spend money buying things like fertilisers, potting mixes, or organic soils for my garden. But environmentally, it's a really great way to feel like you are doing your bit to help reduce the organic material ending up in landfill, contributing to those greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. If you are already composting, a really big thank you to you for doing your bit to help out the environment. And if you haven't started on your journey yet, I really encourage you to give it a try. Call out if you need any help to the environmental education team here at Council. And thank you for being an environmental hero. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.